It was late summer of 2016, and I was 33 years old. My wife, Hannah, was 31. We had been married for almost 4 years, and by then we were both working jobs that kept us indoors far too often. She worked in an office as a graphic designer, and I was doing long shifts at a manufacturing plant. We needed a break, something away from phones, computers, and the noise of town. Camping seemed like the perfect escape. We chose a spot in northern Michigan, far from the usual tourist campgrounds. I had found a mention of it on an old outdoors forum, a backcountry clearing near the Osable River, about a 2-mile hike from where we could park the car. The directions weren't exact, but that was part of what appealed to me. It was secluded, quiet, and as close to off the grid as we could get without flying out west. That Saturday morning, we packed the car with our gear, tent, sleeping bags, a cooler with food, a small camp stove, and the usual extras like flashlights and a hatchet. Hannah teased me for bringing too much, but I've always had the habit of overpacking. We left home around 9 a.m., drove for almost 5 hours, and pulled off the main highway onto a dirt road that seemed more like a forgotten logging trail. By the time we parked, the air felt heavy and sticky, the way it gets before rain. We shouldered our packs, locked the car, and started the hike. The path wasn't well marked, but the old forum post had mentioned a narrow trail running along the riverbank, and after pushing through some underbrush, we found it. The hike was quiet. No other campers, no voices, not even distant sounds of traffic. Just the river moving steadily beside us and the buzzing of insects in the thick trees. When we finally reached the clearing, it felt like we had stepped into a hidden pocket of the woods. A soft patch of grass spread out near the water. Tall pines surrounded it like walls, and there was already a fire ring of stones in the center. Whoever had been there before us hadn't left any trash behind, which made me like the spot even more. We set up the tent facing the river, unrolled our sleeping bags inside, and then gathered some wood before the sun went down. The air grew cooler by the water, and Hannah wrapped herself in a hoodie while I built the fire. By dark, we were cooking hot dogs on sticks and sharing a can of beer. Everything felt calm, exactly the kind of break we'd wanted. But later that night, the quiet changed. I woke up around 2 in the morning. At first, I thought it was the sound of the river that pulled me out of sleep, but then I realized it wasn't steady water. It was footsteps, slow, uneven crunches moving through the brush just outside the tent. My first thought was deer. This was Michigan, after all, and deer moved through the woods all the time. I held still, waiting for it to pass, but the steps didn't move off. They circled. One set of crunches along the left side, then a pause, then another set of crunches along the back of the tent. My chest tightened. It didn't sound like 4 legs on leaves. It sounded like someone walking. I stayed frozen, listening. Hannah was still asleep beside me, breathing slow and even. I didn't want to wake her until I was sure. The footsteps moved again, now toward the river. I heard something shift against the rocks near the fire pit, then silence. I waited. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. Finally, after what felt like forever, the sound faded. I stayed awake until the first hint of dawn bled into the trees. When Hannah stirred, I told her we probably had a raccoon or something near camp in the night, but inside I wasn't convinced. That morning I walked the edges of the clearing, looking for tracks. The ground was soft near the fire ring, and there were clear impressions, boots. Human. Someone had been there, walking around our tent while we slept. I didn't tell Hannah. I didn't want to ruin the trip for her. Instead, I suggested we take a long walk upriver during the day, and we did. We hiked, ate lunch on a log, and even swam in a shallow bend. For a while, I let myself relax, but that evening the unease returned. When the sun dipped low and the woods grew darker, I couldn't stop scanning the tree-line. Every sound, the snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves, felt louder, closer. Hannah tried to read by the firelight, but I barely touched my food. We went into the tent earlier that night. I kept a flashlight beside me, along with the hatchet. I told myself it was just in case of animals, but I knew the real reason. Around midnight, I woke again. This time, I didn't hear footsteps. Instead, I saw light, a faint, flickering glow filtering through the thin nylon of the tent. At first, I thought our campfire had somehow restarted, but then I realized it was moving, drifting between the trees like someone walking with a lantern or flashlight. My throat went dry. The glow passed along the tree-line, paused, then disappeared. I lay rigid, straining to hear. Nothing. Then, minutes later, I heard it. The same slow crunch of footsteps circling again. I shook Hannah gently awake. She stirred, confused, until she heard it too. Her eyes widened in the dim light. We both stayed silent, listening to whoever it was step around our camp for what felt like half an hour. At one point, something brushed against the corner of the tent. Finally, the sound moved off toward the river again. We waited, not daring to move, until exhaustion pulled us back into restless sleep. To first light, we packed up. Neither of us said much. I checked the fire ring again and found fresh footprints in the damp earth, larger than my own boot size. They weren't there the day before. Someone had been standing only a few feet from where we cooked dinner. The hike back to the car felt endless. Every snapping twig behind us made me turn around, but nothing followed. When we finally reached the car and locked the doors, both of us let out shaky breaths we'd been holding the whole way back. On the drive home, with the woods fading behind us, the weight of it settled in. It hadn't been animals, and it hadn't been our imagination. Someone had been out there in the dark with us, circling our tent, watching. They hadn't said a word or shown themselves, but they wanted us to know they were there. We never went back to that spot. In fact, Hannah hasn't agreed to camp anywhere without other people nearby since. For me, the memory still comes back whenever I'm outside at night. The sound of slow, deliberate footsteps in dry leaves, circling, waiting. What scared me most wasn't what they did. It was what they didn't do. Whoever was out there could have come closer, could have spoken, could have done something. Instead, they just walked around us in the dark, letting us know that we weren't alone, and that they were the ones deciding how the night would end. I had been wanting to get away from work for a while, and in the summer of 2017, I finally made the decision to take a week off and head out camping by myself. I was 29 at the time, living in Ohio, and I picked a spot in southern Kentucky near the Daniel Boone National Forest. I had camped plenty of times before, but always with friends or my brother. This time, I wanted the kind of quiet you only get when you're completely alone. No phones, no noise, no schedules, just me, a tent, and the woods. I left early in the morning, my little hatchback packed with a tent, a sleeping bag, some food, a small cooler, and a single burner stove. I had printed maps and written directions in case I lost cell service, which I knew was likely. By early afternoon, I had found a dirt pull-off near a narrow trail that led down toward a small creek. The sun was out and the air was thick with summer humidity, the kind where your shirt clings to your back just from walking a few minutes. I hiked down maybe half a mile before I found a good flat area under a cluster of big sycamore trees. The creek bent close enough that I could hear the water moving over rocks, but not so close that I'd be worried if it rained. It felt secluded, too secluded in hindsight. I set up my tent, laid out my sleeping bag, stacked some firewood I gathered, and made myself something small to eat before dark. The first night was calm. I lay in the tent, half zipped open to let some air in, listening to the constant buzz of cicadas and the occasional plop of something falling into the creek. I didn't fall asleep right away, but eventually the fatigue from the drive and the heat pulled me under. The second day, I hiked deeper into the woods. The trails weren't marked well, and I ended up wandering farther than I intended. At one point, I thought I heard something behind me, like dry branches snapping, but every time I turned around, the trees just stood there in their thick summer green. I told myself it was deer or maybe a raccoon. By mid-afternoon, I made it back to camp, sweaty and thirsty, but glad to see my tent still there exactly as I left it. That evening, I built a small fire and cooked some beans. As the sky went dark, I noticed something odd. Across the creek, maybe 30 yards away, the brush looked trampled. At first, I thought it was an animal path, but the longer I stared, the more it looked like fresh tracks, like someone had walked back and forth, pushing branches aside. It unsettled me, but I forced myself to ignore it. I figured hunters sometimes came through, and I wasn't exactly on private land. When I went to bed that night, I zipped the tent completely shut. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. They weren't animal steps. They were slow, deliberate, crushing through the leaves around my campsite. My heart slammed in my chest as I lay there frozen. The steps circled, then stopped. The woods went dead quiet. No insects, no movement. I held my breath, waiting, listening. After what felt like an hour but was probably 5 minutes, I heard the footsteps fade away, heading down toward the creek. I didn't sleep after that. I just lay there, staring at the thin fabric of the tent, every sound amplified. At dawn, I crawled out. Nothing looked disturbed, but in the dirt, I saw faint shoe prints. They weren't mine. They were larger, heavier, and led from the brush near the creek straight past my tent before fading into the woods. The sun made me feel a little braver, but I couldn't shake the image of someone standing outside while I slept. I told myself I'd stay one more night, then leave. It was stupid, but I didn't want to feel like I'd been run out of the woods. I spent the day closer to camp, collecting more firewood and keeping an eye on the tree line. Every so often, I thought I caught movement just at the edge of vision, but when I focused, it was nothing. That evening, I made the fire bigger than before, the flames giving me some comfort. I ate, cleaned up, and sat listening to the creek. The air felt heavier than the nights before, thick and still, as if even the forest was waiting. I eventually forced myself into the tent, knife tucked beside me, every nerve wired tight. Sometime after midnight, I woke again. This time the sound wasn't just footsteps. It was breathing, slow, deep breathing just outside the thin nylon wall of my tent. My blood turned to ice. I didn't move, didn't even blink. The breathing shifted like whoever it was had crouched down low, close to the ground, right next to me. I could hear the faint crunch of fabric as I tightened my grip on the knife. Then, just as sudden, the sound was gone. The silence pressed in heavy. I waited, counting every second. My arm cramped from holding the knife so tight, but I couldn't let go. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me into a restless half-sleep. When the sun came up, I unzipped the tent slowly and stepped out. My fire pit had been scattered, not by wind or an animal. The rocks I had arranged were shoved aside like someone kicked them. The shoe prints were clearer now, circling the tent, stopping inches from where my head had been while I slept. That was enough. I packed everything as fast as I could. My hands shook so bad I dropped the stakes twice. The whole time, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching. By the time I got back to the car, sweat poured down my back though the morning air was cool. The drive out of the forest felt longer than the drive in. Every curve in the dirt road made me check the rearview mirror. I didn't see anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling I was being followed. When I finally hit the main road, I pulled over, sat in the car with the doors locked, and just breathed until my hands stopped shaking enough to grip the wheel. I never went back to that spot. For weeks after, I'd wake in the middle of the night, convinced I heard breathing outside my bedroom window. I replaced my apartment locks, added a chain, and even taped the seams of my curtains shut. Years later, I still don't know who was out there with me. Maybe a hunter, maybe someone living off the grid, or maybe just a stranger who wanted to scare me. All I know is that it wasn't an animal. Someone walked around my tent, stood over me while I slept, and left without a word. That kind of silence is worse than anything else. It meant they weren't lost, they weren't curious, they were choosing not to be seen. And that's the part that stuck with me the most. Out there in the woods, there are no neighbors, no police down the street, no locks between you and whoever decides to step into your camp. Just thin nylon walls, a knife too small to matter, and the sound of someone breathing where they shouldn't be. I was 21 years old when I decided to take a short camping trip by myself in late October of 2012. I had just finished a long week of work in a small town called Redmond, Oregon, and I wanted some space away from everything. No phone service, no people, just the sound of rain and the woods around me. I had always liked being alone outdoors. It felt calm, simple, like the world slowed down and gave me room to breathe. That weekend, I drove out toward an area near the Ochoco National Forest, packed with thick pine and fir trees that stretched for miles. I picked a rough spot a little ways off the main dirt road, enough where I knew I wouldn't see anyone walking by. The sky was already gray when I set up my tent, and I could tell the weather was turning. I had a small two-man tent, a decent sleeping bag, a cheap lantern, and a cooler with some food. Nothing fancy, but it was enough for one night out. I gathered some wood quickly before the rain started and stacked it under a tarp so I could try to keep it dry. The air had that sharp smell that comes right before a storm, damp earth mixed with pine needles. By the time I boiled water on my little camping stove for noodles, the first drops of rain started to hit the ground. It wasn't heavy at first, just a slow patter against the tarp overhead. But I knew it was going to get worse. I ate fast, cleaned my small pot, and zipped everything up in bags so nothing would get soaked. When the rain picked up, I climbed into my tent with a book, laying back and listening to the sound of water hitting nylon. For a while, it was peaceful. The steady rhythm of rain hitting the tent almost made me fall asleep, but around 11 p.m., it changed. The rain came down harder, like handfuls of gravel being thrown down from the sky. The wind shook the branches above me, and every so often I'd hear the crack of wood, distant trees swaying and snapping in the gusts. The ground turned soft, sucking in water, and I felt little rivers starting to push their way under the floor of my tent. I kept shifting around, making sure my sleeping bag stayed off the edges where the water was seeping through. My flashlight beam caught the walls of the tent bowing in with the wind, and for the first time that night, I started to feel uneasy. I wasn't scared of storms, but I was alone, far enough from the road that no one would hear me if something went wrong. Sometime close to midnight, I heard something that cut through the noise of the storm, a sharp sound, like a heavy branch breaking. It wasn't far away either. I froze, my heart kicking up. At first I told myself it was just the wind, but then I thought about how saturated the ground was, how trees can give way in storms like this. The idea of a tree coming down on my tent made me sit up fast. I unzipped the tent just a little and stuck my flashlight out. The rain blew in sideways, cold and sharp against my face. The beam cut through the trees, rain streaking like silver lines across it, but I couldn't see anything broken or moving. Still, the forest felt alive in a different way, like it was shifting and pressing closer. I zipped it shut again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I shouldn't be in that spot. I tried to lie back down, but then another sound came. Not a branch this time. It was softer, uneven, footsteps in wet ground. My stomach tightened instantly. I held my breath, listening, every nerve on edge. It was faint, but it was real. The sound of someone moving slowly between the trees, not far from my tent. The rain should have drowned out everything, yet I could hear the squelch of mud under shoes. I told myself it could be an animal, maybe a deer, but deep down I knew it wasn't. Animals move differently. This was steady, deliberate, one step after another. My hand tightened around my flashlight, and I sat completely still. The footsteps stopped. The storm kept pounding, but I knew whoever or whatever it was hadn't gone. They were close. My tent felt paper-thin, useless, like one layer of fabric couldn't possibly keep me safe. I pictured someone standing just beyond the nylon wall, listening, waiting for me to make a sound. Minutes dragged by, though it felt like hours. My legs started to cramp from sitting so rigid, but I didn't dare move. Finally, the steps started again, this time slower, circling. My chest ached from holding my breath. I could hear water dripping off branches, mud sucking under weight. At one point, I swore I saw a shadow move across the faint glow of my lantern, like a figure passing by. I wanted to believe it was just my mind playing tricks, but the steps were too clear. I thought about unzipping the tent and shining my light out, but the idea of locking eyes with someone out there in the storm froze me in place. I stayed inside, listening, every sense stretched thin. Then, just as sudden as it started, the footsteps faded into the storm. It was hard to tell exactly when they disappeared because the rain was so loud, but eventually, all I could hear was water hammering the tent and branches creaking in the wind. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I kept the flashlight on, gripping it tight, flinching at every noise. By around 5 a.m., the storm slowed, and pale gray light began to filter through the trees. The ground was soaked, puddles everywhere, and my gear was damp, but I didn't care. The second I felt like it was light enough, I packed up fast. My hands shook as I shoved the wet tent into my bag, my eyes constantly flicking around the trees. When I finally walked back to where I had parked my car, my boots sinking into the mud, I stopped dead. There were footprints, not mine. They were spaced wider, deeper, and they came out of the tree-line, circling close to where my tent had been before heading back into the woods. I crouched down, my stomach sinking as I saw the tread pattern. Clear, heavy shoe prints. It hadn't been an animal. I stood there for a long moment, the damp morning air pressing cold into my skin, before I forced myself to keep walking. I threw my gear into the back seat, climbed in, and locked the doors as fast as I could. My heart was still pounding as I started the engine, mud spraying under my tires as I pushed down the road. I didn't look back. That was the last time I ever camped alone. I still think about it sometimes, about the sound of those footsteps circling me in the dark, in the middle of that storm. Whoever it was never tried to speak, never touched my tent, never showed themselves. But I know they were there and they knew I was too. And that was enough to make me realize just how thin the walls of a tent really are. I was 26 the first time I decided to go camping completely alone. I had done plenty of trips with friends before, sometimes even with my younger brother tagging along. But this was different. It was 2015, late August, and I was living in Colorado at the time. I worked at a warehouse in Denver, long hours on my feet, dealing with machines, lifting boxes, the usual grind. I remember feeling worn out with the constant routine. So when I finally got a 3-day weekend off, I thought I'd head into the mountains, away from everything, away from the sound of trucks backing up and the buzzing of fluorescent lights. I picked a spot near Gunnison National Forest, not too far from Blue Mesa Reservoir. I had never camped around there before, but the photos online made it look perfect. Wide open land mixed with thick patches of forest, enough space to set up without feeling boxed in. I loaded up my old Jeep with my tent, a cooler, a small propane stove, sleeping bag, water, and a few tools just in case. I left my phone mostly charged, but figured I wouldn't have service up there anyway. The drive itself was long and quiet. By the time I got into the dirt roads that cut deep into the forest, it was late afternoon. I remember how the sun was starting to tilt low, making everything golden through the trees. Dust rose behind my Jeep as I slowly bumped along the uneven road. I finally found a small clearing that looked perfect. It wasn't a designated campsite, more like an open patch of ground tucked between some trees and a steep slope that dropped into a gulch below. It was far enough from the road that I wouldn't hear passing cars, but close enough that if something went wrong, I could still walk back. I set up my tent and built a small fire pit using some stones I found nearby. The forest was silent except for the faint rustle of wind and a few birds calling. I cooked some food on my little stove and sat back as the sun went down. For a while it felt exactly how I hoped. Peaceful, no noise, just me and the wide open air. That first night was colder than I expected. I woke up several times, shifting around in my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds outside the tent. Twigs snapped now and then, and I assumed it was deer or smaller animals moving around. At one point, I thought I heard something heavier in the brush, but it faded after a while. I pushed it out of my mind and went back to sleep. The next morning, I made coffee on my stove and hiked a short way up a ridge near my campsite. From up there, I could see the reservoir far off in the distance and the rolling tree line stretching forever. It was the kind of view that made me glad I had come. By the time I hiked back down, though, I noticed something strange near my camp. There were boot prints in the dirt near my fire pit. At first, I thought they were mine from the night before, but I looked closely and realized they weren't. The tread didn't match my boots, and they circled around my tent, not just passed through. I crouched down and studied them for a long time. They looked fresh, the edges sharp, not worn down by time or weather. I didn't know what to think, but I tried to shrug it off, convincing myself maybe they were old, from someone who had camped here before me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been near my tent while I was sleeping. That day, I tried to distract myself by fishing at the gulch below, though I kept glancing back up toward where my camp sat. The woods felt different. Every crack of a branch made me tense up. At one point, I thought I saw movement between the trees, just a quick shift of something pale. But when I looked again, it was gone. By the time evening rolled around, I debated packing up and leaving, but pride got the better of me. I told myself I'd just keep the fire going late into the night, and maybe that would keep any curious hikers or animals away. As the darkness fell, I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, listening to the forest. I swear I heard something faint, like footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving in the brush, not crashing through it like an animal, but careful, measured. I held onto the hatchet I kept by the fire and sat as still as I could. The sound would stop for minutes at a time, then start again, always shifting location, like it was circling me. When I finally got the courage to go into my tent, I left the hatchet inside with me, close by. Sleep didn't come easy. Every little sound outside made me sit up and hold my breath. Sometime in the middle of the night, I heard the sound of fabric brushing, like something lightly touching the outside of my tent. My chest tightened, and I gripped the hatchet so hard my hand cramped. I stayed frozen, hardly breathing, waiting for the sound again. But after a long while, it stopped. When morning finally came, I crawled out of the tent, and my stomach dropped. There were more boot prints around the site, fresh again, pressed deep into the dirt from the dew. Whoever it was had walked right up to my tent, circled it several times, and then vanished back into the woods. My fire pit had been disturbed too. The stones shifted slightly, almost like someone had tried to knock it apart. At that point, I was done. I packed everything as fast as I could, shoving things into the Jeep without care. My hands shook as I collapsed the tent, scanning the tree line every few seconds, convinced I'd see someone standing there, watching. The drive out felt like it took forever. Every bend in the road, I expected to see another vehicle blocking the way or someone stepping out. But the road stayed empty. By the time I hit pavement again, I felt like I could finally breathe. My shoulders ached from the tension I'd been holding. When I got home, I told myself maybe it was just a hunter or another camper messing with me. But the truth is, there was no reason for anyone to be out there, circling my tent in the middle of the night, silently walking around while I slept. It's been years since that trip, and I still haven't camped alone again. I stick to public campgrounds now, places with people nearby, where the glow of other fires is visible in the distance. I never told many people about what happened, because it sounds like paranoia, but I know what I saw. I know what I heard. Out there in those woods, someone was watching me, and I'll never forget the feeling of being inside that thin nylon tent, completely exposed, knowing that nothing but a zipper separated me from whoever was out there in the dark. I was 24 the summer I decided to camp in a graveyard. It sounds strange when I think back on it now, but at the time it didn't feel like a bad idea. I had been traveling through rural Kentucky in 2015, taking back roads and staying away from busy campgrounds. I wanted quiet places, spots where no one else would bother me. I had an old tent, a sleeping bag that smelled faintly of mildew, and a cooler stuffed with cheap food and warm cans of beer. I didn't plan things well back then. I would just drive until I was tired and then pick somewhere to crash for the night. That particular evening, I had been driving through farm country. The sun was sinking, painting the sky orange and pink, and the road stretched empty for miles in either direction. I hadn't seen a gas station in hours. When I came around a bend, I noticed a narrow gravel path leading off to the right. A rusted metal gate leaned open, and behind it, I saw old stone markers scattered across a hill. A cemetery. It didn't look like anyone had been there in years. The grass grew up past my knees when I stepped out to look, and the stones were cracked, some leaning sideways like crooked teeth. The place looked abandoned. That's why I chose it. I figured no one would care if I pitched a tent there for one night. It wasn't the first time I had camped somewhere I wasn't supposed to. I hauled my gear up the hill, avoiding holes in the ground where the earth had sunk around old graves. The smell of wildflowers mixed with damp soil, and mosquitoes whined in the air. My boots crunched over dry grass and twigs as I picked a spot near a cluster of cedar trees. By the time I set up the tent, darkness was creeping in. Crickets buzzed loud in the weeds, and bats flitted overhead. The grave markers stood like silent company, their names rubbed away by rain and time. Some were so worn down they looked like plain stones. I remember kneeling near one marker and running my hand over the faded letters, trying to make out a name, but my fingers only felt rough grooves and lichen. I ate cold beans from a can and drank one of the warm beers, sitting on a flat stone as the night settled deeper. The air cooled fast, and the stillness was thick, almost heavy. Out in the distance, maybe half a mile away, I heard the faint sound of a dog barking. Otherwise, nothing. No cars, no voices, no movement except the bugs and the occasional rustle in the weeds. At first, the quiet felt peaceful, but after an hour, it started pressing on me. When you're alone in a place like that, your senses sharpen too much. Every sound seems louder. I heard twigs snapping far off and brushed it off as deer. Then a branch cracked closer, and I told myself it was raccoons. My nerves twitched, though. The thought of people popped into my mind. Teenagers messing around, or worse, someone who lived nearby seeing my car on the road and deciding to come check me out. I crawled into the tent just after midnight. I left the rain flap open to let in air, but I kept the mesh zipped. The moon was bright enough to light the field, and I could see shadows of the headstones through the mesh. The ground was hard under me, and I shifted around, trying to get comfortable. I told myself I'd sleep soon, but sleep didn't come. Around 1 in the morning, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps in the grass. My whole body stiffened. I held my breath and strained to listen. The steps stopped, then started again, closer this time. It wasn't an animal. It was too heavy, too measured. I sat up in the tent, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would shake the thin nylon. Through the mesh, I couldn't see anything moving, but I knew someone was out there. The sound came from my left, then circled slowly behind me. Whoever it was didn't speak, didn't run, just walked in a wide arc. I kept thinking about the fact that no one knew I was there. If something happened, no one would come looking for me. I fumbled quietly for my pocket knife, the only thing I had. It was dull, barely good enough to cut rope, but I gripped it tight anyway. The footsteps faded for a while, but then I heard a scrape, like something dragging across stone. I swallowed hard and leaned close to the mesh, scanning the graves. For a second, I caught sight of movement. A dark shape hunched low, slipping between the markers. I froze. It looked like a person crouching, trying to stay hidden. I sat in that tent for what felt like hours, barely blinking, my knife clutched in my hand. Every few minutes I'd hear another sound. Grass rustling, a faint tap against stone, the crunch of dirt. Whoever it was, they didn't leave. They circled, slow and patient, like they were waiting. At some point, I must have dozed off out of pure exhaustion. When I opened my eyes again, dawn was starting to bleed across the sky. Pale blue light spilled over the hill, and the cemetery looked different in the morning. The markers were just stones again. The grass just grass. Nothing out of place. I unzipped the tent and stepped out cautiously, scanning the area. That's when I saw it. Just a few feet from my tent, near a tilted headstone, the ground was disturbed. Fresh boot prints in the dirt, circling my campsite. Not animal tracks, real footprints, deep enough to show tread patterns. My chest tightened when I counted them. Whoever it was had walked around my tent at least 3 or 4 times in the night. I packed up fast, my hands shaking the whole time. I didn't eat, didn't stop to check anything else. I shoved the tent into the trunk, climbed into the car, and drove until I found a gas station on the main road. I sat there in the parking lot for an hour, sipping burnt coffee and staring at nothing, trying to settle my nerves. I never told anyone about it in detail, not then. It's been years now, but I still think about that night. Not the part where I heard footsteps. That could have been anyone, some farmer, a drifter, even kids messing around. What stays with me is the silence, the patience of whoever it was. No voice, no attempt to scare me off, no words at all. Just circling, waiting, leaving prints behind like they wanted me to know I wasn't alone. That was the last time I ever camped anywhere near a graveyard. I was 24 when I decided to take a short solo trip through Austria in the summer of 2016. I had been living in Munich for about a year, and on a whim I bought a small tent, stuffed my backpack with some gear, and took a train south into the mountains. I didn't plan much, just wanted to camp somewhere quiet, away from the cities, away from everything. By late afternoon, after a long day of walking along winding trails near the border of Styria, I found a flat patch of grass beside a narrow dirt road that cut through a dense forest. The road looked barely used, maybe only by the occasional hiker or farmer. It was far from any main town, just a few wooden farmhouses scattered miles apart. The place seemed perfect, tucked away, no people around, only the sound of wind in the trees. I set up my tent in a small clearing, the canvas looking tiny against the tall, dark pines. The air smelled of resin and damp earth. I boiled some water on my little camping stove, ate noodles, and sat against my backpack watching the light fade. The sun dropped behind the ridges, and soon the forest was wrapped in that thick silence you only notice when you're truly alone. By the time night fully settled, I lay in my tent, staring at the ceiling. It was one of those nights when even the insects seemed quiet. No cars, no voices, no movement, just stillness. I remember drifting off and waking again several times, restless from the hard ground. At some point, maybe around 2 or 3 in the morning, I woke up to the faint crunch of footsteps outside. At first, I thought it might be an animal, a deer maybe, or even a boar. But the sound wasn't right. It was steady, heavy, and slow, like boots pressing down on gravel. I froze, holding my breath, trying to listen. The footsteps stopped. Then I heard nothing. I told myself it was my imagination. Alone in the woods, your brain plays tricks. But a few minutes later, I heard it again. This time closer. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Someone was out there, walking just beyond the thin sheet of fabric separating me from the night. My mouth went dry. I didn't move, didn't even shift the sleeping bag. I kept thinking, what if it was just a lost hiker? What if someone had a cabin nearby? But why would anyone walk around this remote road in the middle of the night? The footsteps stopped again, but I could feel it. Someone was standing there. I don't know how long it lasted. Could have been 30 seconds, maybe 2 minutes. Then came the soft sound of fabric brushing, like clothes shifting. I dared to turn my head slightly and peered through the tiny mesh window of my tent. First, I saw nothing, just darkness and the outline of trees. Then, at the edge of the clearing, I spotted him, a man. He was standing half in the shadows, maybe 15 or 20 feet away, not moving, just facing my tent. He wasn't carrying a light, wasn't holding any gear, just standing there like he had been watching for who knows how long. He looked tall, thin, and I could make out the pale shape of his face, even though the rest of him blended with the darkness. My heart was hammering so loud I thought he'd hear it. I didn't know what to do. Every instinct told me not to move, not to give away that I had seen him. I just lay there, staring through the mesh, barely breathing. After what felt like forever, he shifted slightly, turned his head, then walked slowly back into the trees. I waited until I couldn't hear his steps anymore. My whole body was shaking. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. Every sound made me jump. The wind in the branches, a snapping twig, the distant hoot of an owl. They all sounded like him coming back. I gripped the little pocket knife I kept by my sleeping bag, though I knew it wouldn't do much if anything happened. When dawn finally came, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The clearing looked normal, peaceful, like nothing had happened. The road was empty, the forest still. But when I looked down at the dirt near the trees, I saw prints, boot marks, deep in the soft soil, leading toward where I'd seen him standing. I packed my things as fast as I could. My hands were shaking so much it took me twice as long to fold the tent. The whole time, I kept glancing at the tree line, expecting him to step out again. Instead of heading deeper along the trail like I'd planned, I turned back toward the village I had passed the day before. It was a long, exhausting walk. I didn't stop to rest, didn't even eat. I just wanted out. The weirdest part is that the whole day, I kept feeling watched. I'd stop to catch my breath, look back down the road, and sometimes I swore I saw a figure far behind me, at the edge of the path. Not close, but always there. When I blinked or looked again, he'd be gone. Maybe it was just paranoia, maybe my mind playing tricks, but it felt too real. By late afternoon, I stumbled into the village, sweating, dehydrated, and tense. People looked at me strangely as I hurried down the street with my oversized backpack. I found the small inn near the church and booked a room. When I locked the door behind me, it was the first time all day I felt safe. I didn't go back to that part of the forest again. A few days later, I cut the trip short and returned to Munich. I never told anyone there the full story, just brushed it off as a bad camping experience. But even now, years later, I can still see his face. Not the details, just the pale shape standing motionless in the dark, watching. That night taught me something I'll never forget. The woods aren't always empty. Sometimes you're not as alone as you think. I had been planning that camping trip for months. It was July of 2013, and I was 24, working long shifts in a warehouse, saving up for school, and desperately needing a break. A buddy of mine was supposed to come with me, but he bailed last minute because of work. I didn't want to waste the time I had already set aside, so I decided to go alone. I packed light but carefully: tent, sleeping bag, a cooler with food, a little propane stove, a flashlight, a hunting knife, a small hatchet, and my old .22 rifle I mostly used for target shooting. I picked a spot in northern Arizona, not too far from the Navajo Nation border, a stretch of land I'd only driven through before. The plan was to set up near a small clearing close to a dried-up creek bed. The land out there feels endless. Rolling desert hills, patches of pinyon pine and juniper, and at night the kind of silence you can't ever get in the city. I left before sunrise and drove 6 hours, the last 2 on a dirt road that rattled the whole truck. The sky was wide and cloudless, heat already shimmering by the time I parked. I set up my tent, unloaded my gear, and then hiked a couple of miles out to get a feel for the area. It was isolated, but not eerie at first. Just quiet, open land with a breeze that smelled faintly of sagebrush and dust. The first day was uneventful. I cooked some beans on the stove, sat in a camp chair, and read a paperback I'd brought. As evening fell, the temperature dropped sharply, as it does in the desert. The night sky was so full of stars it almost looked fake, like a painted dome overhead. I remember feeling small but calm. The second day I hiked further, following the creek bed until it twisted into thicker brush. I noticed tracks in the dust: deer, rabbits, maybe a coyote. Normal enough. Around noon, I climbed a ridge and looked out across the valley. That's when I saw something odd. A figure in the distance, standing still near the tree-line on the opposite ridge. It looked human at first glance, tall and thin, but too far away to make out. I figured it was just another camper or a rancher passing through, though I hadn't seen a single car or house for miles. By the time I climbed down and looked again, the figure was gone. That evening, I cooked some instant noodles and tried to shake the unease. But the memory of that figure stuck with me. The silence of the land felt heavier, almost like it was listening. When it got dark, I crawled into my tent and tried to sleep. Sometime past midnight, I woke up to a sound outside. At first I thought it was wind, but then I realized it was footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling my campsite. Gravel crunching, then stopping, then crunching again. My heart pounded so hard I felt it in my throat. I reached for the flashlight and my rifle, lying beside the sleeping bag. I forced myself to stay still, breathing shallowly, listening. The steps stopped just outside the tent. I didn't move. After what felt like forever, the sound faded, footsteps trailing off into the distance. I lay there until dawn broke, every muscle aching from tension. The next morning, I found footprints around the tent.
Bare footprints.
Human. They circled in uneven loops, stopping just inches from the fabric wall where my head had been. The prints were long and narrow, with the toes splayed out unnaturally far. My stomach turned when I saw how deep they were pressed into the dirt, like whoever or whatever made them was heavier than they should have been. I told myself it had to be some drifter, maybe high or mentally unstable. That was the most logical explanation. But even telling myself that, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I debated packing up right then and heading home, but stubbornness kept me there. I'd driven all this way. I'd prepared for this trip, and I didn't want to admit that a little fear could send me running. So I stayed. The day dragged on, hot and still. I barely ate, kept my rifle close, and checked the tree every few minutes. By evening, I was exhausted but too wounded up to sleep. I kept the fire going brighter than usual, feeding it with nearly all the wood I'd collected. At some point late in the night, I heard it again. Not footsteps this time, but a sound I still can't forget. It was a voice, a human voice, calling out from the dark. It wasn't words, not really. It was broken, like someone trying to remember how to speak. The tone kept shifting, too deep one moment, too high the next, stretched out in ways no throat should make. And worse, it was trying to sound like me. Took me a moment to realize that. It was my own voice, calling from the trees, mocking the way I breathed, the way I coughed earlier that day, like it had been studying me. I didn't move. I sat frozen by the fire, staring into the dark. The voice called again, closer now, jagged and wrong. My skin prickled with cold sweat. The brush at the edge of the clearing rustled, and I caught sight of something crouched low, just beyond the firelight. For a second, it looked like a man crawling on all fours, but the limbs were bent wrong, too long, too stiff. Its head jerked upward, and two pale eyes reflected the flames. That broke me. I grabbed the rifle and fired into the dark. The sound echoed across the valley, and whatever was out there shrieked. Not like an animal, not like a man, but something in between. I fired again, and the rustling snapped away into the distance. I stayed awake until dawn, fire burning low, rifle in my lap, shaking so bad I could barely hold it. When morning finally came, I walked to the tree with the rifle still in my hands. I half expected to see blood, but there was nothing. No trail, no body, just more of those strange, heavy footprints leading off into the brush before vanishing into rocky ground. That was enough for me. I packed in a rush, tossing things haphazardly into the truck bed, leaving behind half my gear. I didn't care. I drove out of there faster than I should have on that rough dirt road, not stopping until I hit the highway. I didn't talk about it for months. When I finally told someone, I left out the details about the voice and the eyes. It sounded insane even to me, but I know what I heard, what I saw, and I know I wasn't alone out there. People always ask why I didn't call the police. What would I have told them? That a barefoot man who could mimic voices was crawling around my campsite in the middle of nowhere? They'd have written me off as some paranoid camper who spent too many nights alone. But I'll tell you this much. I've never camped alone again. I won't go near that part of Arizona, not even driving through. And sometimes, even now, if I'm walking home late at night and the street is too quiet, I swear I hear it again. My own voice whispering from somewhere it shouldn't be.